Hello, my name is Taylor. I'm a financial coach, and I am here to show you guys how to deal with emergency funds inside Monarch Money. It's a very common question that I'm getting often is how to track your emergency fund, where to put your emergency fund. Is it a category? Is it a goal? And I want to walk you through those two scenarios because both are correct, but there are pros and cons to each. So let's dive into it. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you have an emergency fund connected to Monarch Money, like you've went into connect your accounts, you have your emergency fund here, you're going to want to rename the account in Monarch, most likely to emergency fund or whatever purpose the account has. Maybe it is your travel fund or whatever it is for you. In this case, we're going to use this as an example, this joint savings. And if I click on the edit button on the top right hand side, and if I click on edit account, I can rename my accounts. I can rename them to whatever I want. And so I can change this to emergency fund. Instead of just joint savings or instead of Chase account 1111, like we want to add some detail to this just so that it's easier for you to see in your dashboard and in your transaction history where the transactions are coming from. So you have an emergency fund account. There's two ways to showcase this in Monarch and track your emergency fund. One is by creating a category and one is goals. So I'm going to go through the category option first. What you would do is you'd go into your settings on the top right or left hand side, the gear icon there, and then you will click on categories. Now I normally suggest making some kind of grouping. You can see each of these groups are different sections for your categories. I normally have my clients create a group for my yearly expenses and sinking funds. These are things that are non-monthly, that are coming up every once in a while. They're not normally in a monthly budget. You may not be budgeting for them on a monthly basis, but they're things that might come up during the year that you want to be planning for. So like, travel and vacation, that's normally not a monthly activity. I mean, sometimes it is, but sometimes it's like once every 6 months to a year, right? And so we don't necessarily need to have it in the budget constantly. So I have a whole group for just those non-monthly, periodic, yearly expenses, sinking funds, all words for the same thing, okay? So sometimes I create the category just inside here. As far as an emergency fund goes, you can have an emergency fund category. Or you can create a whole different group for it. You can also create a group for your emergency fund. Maybe you have multiple kinds of emergency funds, or you just want it in its own group, which is totally fine. It's going to bring it all the way down to the bottom, and I'm going to just drag and drop this to the top so it's next to my sinking funds. Normally I actually do have these in the bottom, but for sake of demonstration, I'm going to put it at the top so I don't have to be scrolling all the time for you. And so we're going to name this emergency fund. We're going to click on this icon, and I'm going to set the icon for something that makes sense. And so I'm going to do something a little bit happier than like an emergency. We're just going to do some leaves. I don't know why, but you can do whatever you want. Okay, so now if I go to my budget, my emergency fund is showing $0. So there's a few things that you can do. One is if you know you're going to be trying to build an emergency fund, maybe you don't have an emergency fund yet, what you want to do is click on this gear icon next to the emergency fund category. Click on that gear icon and turn on the monthly rollover. If you are not using rollovers in your budget, and this is the only rollover you have, that's fine. But if you also have, the rollovers do just add a level of complexity that you would need to watch my video on how to deal with rollovers. So like if you're not sure how to use rollovers, then this might not be the way you want to go. And if you're also trying to budget in a more passive way, rollovers also can make it a little tricky to budget in a passive way. But here's where we start, right? We have the rollover turned on. We can set the starting month to any month in the past or now. And we have this item here for a starting balance. Now, if you don't have an emergency fund right now, we're going to leave this blank, right? We're going to press save. And now we're going to be saying, hey, out of my income that I have, so I'm budgeting $84.10 of income, I would like to be setting aside $500 for my emergency fund. And so now you are trying to budget for it, and as you budget for it, it's going to accrue. And when the rollover, when September hits in this demonstration, we're in August and in this budget right here, when September hits, you are going to see $1,000 because the 500 is going to roll over, and you're going to have $500 next month adding to that, and so it's going to be 1,000. Then the next month will be 1,500, and then 2,000, and so on and so forth. So that can be really helpful as you're building it. Now, notice that if I actually went to make the transfer, let's say I do make that transfer to my emergency fund, which means I logged into my bank account. I logged into Chase. I submitted the transfer because that was my intention to set aside $500 every month to go into my emergency fund. Instantaneously or 24 hours later, depending on when Monarch wants to sync that transaction, it's going to show up in Monarch, right? Once you've made the transfer, the transfers will sync into Monarch and they'll be available. There'll be two, right? There'll be one leaving your checking account and one entering your emergency funds. There'll be two line items generally, as long as both accounts are feeding transactions into Monarch. You'll normally have two. I mark them both as transfers. Notice in my budget that this is not going to show up as having been set aside, right? It's still going to say zero here because you didn't spend anything in your emergency fund. You have not marked anything as an emergency fund necessary expense. And here's the thing, you probably never will. You're never going to actually categorize anything in the emergency fund. Well, that's optional, but I'll show you why you might not want to, okay? So there is no proof that I've done it. It really is up to you to make sure this happens. You need to log into your bank account, make sure it happens. You still only mark these transactions as transfers. They do not show up in your budget. Okay. Then let's say the reason why this is really helpful to do this as a category is that you may also have a starting balance with your emergency fund. You have this gear icon here that turns on that rollover and you can set a starting balance. And remember, my starting balance in my emergency fund is 50,615. Well, I just contributed 500 and I'm budgeting 500. So I'm actually going to set that starting balance right here to 50,115. Okay, the reason why I'm doing that is if I set that starting balance to that number and I've budgeted 500 for that, I got this to match. So it's that number plus 500 equals 50,615. And that is what's in this emergency fund according to my account balance right here. So I kind of like those to match. And so here's what's helpful about doing this as a category instead of a goal is when I have an emergency comes up, like an auto maintenance expense. I want to categorize that emergency expense, even though it's going to come from my emergency fund. I want to categorize this as auto maintenance because I want to, at the end of the year, run a report and ask how much did I spend on auto maintenance. And if I have a whole bunch of different emergency fund expenses in my emergency fund, I have a medical thing that came up, I have an auto maintenance thing that came up, my reports aren't going to be very clear. When I run a report how much I spent on medical, it's not going to be there. There's going to be no transactions in medical because I've categorized them as an emergency fund expense. So you'll never actually use the category emergency fund. Like we're always going to still categorize the item as needing to be an auto maintenance, so like whatever it truly was, so that when I see how much did I spend on auto maintenance, that's available to me. Now, the cool thing about having this as a category is that when I click on this red bubble, I can now use my emergency fund expenses to cover this maintenance. I have a $1,000 expense that went over budget. I don't have enough funds in my budget for it. So if I click on save, it's going to pull $1,000 from this amount right here, and it's going to put that right here. It just put it right here. Now, notice that this is just like a spreadsheet, guys. This is not actually doing anything to your accounts. Nothing moved in your accounts yet. This is like your own mental accounting software. This is like you writing on pen and paper, hey, I'm going to minus 1,000 for my emergency fund plus to my auto maintenance and I'm good to go. Well, you still have to actually make sure you go make the withdrawal, right? You need to, if you put the auto maintenance charge on a credit card, you still need to make sure you go pay that card off. And likely in your budget, if you didn't have anything saved in your checking account, you're going to need to pull from your emergency fund. So my balance is saying 49,615, and my balance here is 50,615. So I need to pull $1,000 from this. And once you do that, then it'll match. So Monarch is driving the transfers you need to make in your budget. It is not your transfers are not driving your budget, meaning like if you make a transfer, your budget's not going to reflect it until you manipulate your budget. If you manipulate your budget and it's showing you, hey, I moved this amount to auto maintenance, then you need to make sure that you go force that balance to match by logging into Chase, moving out $1,000 from your emergency funds so that you can go pay the credit card for your auto expenses. Now, a downside is that there is no record of this. Like there's no record saying that, hey, I clicked on this bubble and I moved it to another category. There's no history. You could move this all around and it gets all wonky sometimes. So you have to be careful with that. So that is option number one on dealing with your emergency fund. Why does this say $5,000 here? Because I budgeted 500 and I moved out 1,000. So there was 500 there. I had to move out 1,000. So it took the first 500 that I budgeted plus another 5,000 or 500 that I didn't have budgeted, and it pulled out 500 from this envelope here. So that can get a little confusing, but it's just saying that you moved 500 out of that envelope over to auto maintenance, but it was really 1,000 because I had 500 in here. So the 500 plus 500 equals 1,000. Okay. So the next way to handle your emergency fund is by creating a goal. And this would be in the case like you didn't have that category. If I just got rid of that category, I did not have it, it is not there, we would be instead using a goal to track the emergency fund. And they even have a already preset section there for you to use for your emergency fund. You can say, I want my emergency fund to be $50,000. And I want it to be that account that I have set up. We're going to link that account that I have already set up for my emergency fund. And then I'm going to press done and next. And then I also maybe want to be contributing another $500 to the emergency fund. Maybe you do, maybe you don't, kind of up to you. And then we're going to press review here, and it's going to add this to our budget in a way. Now you'll notice that remember, we got rid of that emergency fund category, so now instead we have an emergency fund in the goal section here. And so now I'm going to want to be budgeting about $500 for my emergency fund goal. And it is incorporating it into this budget, right? You just brought that left to budget down. You're budgeting a part of your income in here, and this is again still your intention. You still need to move the funds into your emergency fund account. You need to log into to Chase or Fidelity or whatever you're using and actually move the funds. Now, if your account is feeding transactions, you can have it also show up in your budget. So I can attach this transaction to my goal, and it will show that, hey, you have actually succeeded in contributing $500 from your emergency fund account. So if I click on this, I can attach it to the goal. And remember, only transactions that are coming from the account that is attached to the goal can be connected to the goal, right? So this one is coming from my emergency fund account, so that's why I can attach it to the goal. If I attach it to the goal, then at the very bottom of the screen, I'm going to have $500 I plan to spend, $500 I actually put in, and it's showing me that I've saved $500 in my emergency fund account. Now, what happens when you have an expense like the auto repair with the goal? So you have that $1,000 auto maintenance expense. You have money in your emergency fund to cover that, and you're going to make a withdrawal to cover that. So meaning you put the auto maintenance expense on a credit card, it's showing up your transactions, you need to pay off the credit card now. So you're going to make a withdrawal. You're going to log into your bank account. You're going to log into Chase, Fidelity, Wells Fargo, whatever it is for you. You're going to pull the $1,000 out, and eventually it's going to show up in Monarch as a transaction. We're going to see that, right? We see a withdrawal of $1,000 from the emergency fund account. We're going to connect this to the goal, to the emergency fund goal. Well, now in our budget, we can see that we not only contributed $500 this month, right? Because that was our normal monthly contribution, but we also took out $1,000. So we're kind of short $1,000 this month, right? Because we did have to withdraw $1,000. This is how much we would need to set aside. In addition to this, we'd need to put back $1,000 if we were trying to increase our emergency fund by $500, this is the goal. We're trying to increase the balance by emergency fund by about $500, but since we had to withdraw $1,000, it is saying that we would need to put $1,000 back in order to make sure that we're contributing $500 and increasing that, right? So that's all this is saying right here. It's a little confusing, but that's what it's saying. Now, notice I can't move this money to cover this goal. This is still a red. This is still red. Like if I looked into my emergency fund, I can see that I contributed and withdrew this month because I had to cover that emergency fund. You can see the transactions in there. But as far as my budget goes, I still have that pesky little red bubble for auto maintenance. A couple things you can do. One is try to replenish this, right? In the next month, instead of contributing to the emergency fund, we're going to be contributing to the auto maintenance expense. Meaning which is the same thing as contributing to the emergency fund. If you noticed, I don't know if you noticed that, but whether you put it back into the auto maintenance category or the emergency fund category, it's kind of doing the same thing. It's just you and mental accounting. It's you on a spreadsheet, pen and paper, and you're saying, I'm going to try to put $500 back into my emergency fund this month. In Monarch, you're just saying you're putting it into this specific category to cover an expense, and that red bubble is a motivator for you to make sure you do get it covered. You will go and replenish that emergency fund because you did have to take it out for auto maintenance. It's really just a different way to look at putting money back in your emergency fund rather than just strictly putting it right here. So that might have been a little confusing. The other thing that you can do is, yes, you pulled it out of the emergency fund, you're comfortable with that, you don't want this red bubble to carry over in future months. Monarch just changed this so that you could actually reset these rollovers. You can reset the rollovers. I believe you have to wait until the next month to do it. There is a button for it. I haven't played around with it a ton, but this is new. So you can reset the rollover, you can start fresh, and the rollover won't carry forward into the future months. And remember that rollover is only on because I turned it on. Maybe you don't have a rollover on. If you don't have this rollover icon, don't worry about it. You have a negative because the negative just says, hey, you pulled from savings to cover an auto maintenance expense. Just leave it. There's no need to hide any transactions. There's no need to remove this. You do not want to also mark that transaction that you pulled from emergency fund as income. You don't want to mark this as auto maintenance, because otherwise, when you run a report on how much have I spent on auto maintenance, it's going to be telling you a very rarely random thing, right? In this case, it's going to be almost like $1,000 or $2,000 because it was two debits, two negatives. But if you use that $1,000 that you put into your checking account as auto maintenance, then it's going to say you spent zero on auto maintenance this year, and you don't want that. When you run a report, you do not want it to show you that you've spent zero on auto maintenance. So a little bit of a tricky one there, but that is how you do emergency funds and goals. It's not quite as straightforward. It's a little bit more, like I said, pen and paper writing, like you're just trying to mark this in your budget so that you have a good visual for it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that everything is happening for you. Like you still have to make sure those transactions happen, and you also have to just reset some things. Sometimes you just have to say, hey, I pulled from savings, now we're moving on. I have the savings to cover it. That's what the emergency fund is there for. I'm just gonna move on from there. So I hope that was helpful. Let me know if there's any questions, comments, anything that you guys found that was not that was confusing. Leave it in the comments. Let me know, and let me know what situations you've run into when it comes to dealing with your emergency fund. I'd love to give some more depth and more tutorials on dealing with those emergency fund expenses and the withdrawals from goals. So thank you so much. Thank you. If you need help in addition to what this video has provided, I do offer workshops coming up soon. So make sure you signed up for the newsletter. You've put in your email for the newsletter, and you will get updates on all of the things that you can get help on, including one-on-one coaching with me to help you look at your Monarch and make any changes and make sure you're just using Monarch in the best way you possibly can so that you can get ahead with your finances and your goals. Okay, so thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for subscribing, and look forward to seeing you soon.